At least for the moment, I think the Chrysler Pacifica is quite simply the best minivan available in America, and that's because of the model that I'm driving today, the Chrysler Pacifica Hybrid. This is one of the best plug-in hybrids you can buy in the United States, and the best minivan, I think, at the moment. Clearly, that's predicated on being able to charge the Pacifica Hybrid, because this is a plug-in hybrid, not a regular hybrid like we find in the new Toyota Sienna. So if you don't have the ability to plug in at home or at work, then I would probably buy something else. I do think that the Chrysler Pacifica is still a really solid option in the minivan segment, but outside the plug-in hybrid, there are a ton of really great options. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's just dive into the plug-in hybrid. For this model year, the Pacifica and the Pacifica Hybrid aren't the only minivans in the Chrysler lineup. There's also a Chrysler Voyager. The main difference is going to be the exterior styling, to be perfectly honest, because the bulk of the vehicle is identical. Obviously not the hybrid model, because if you want a hybrid, there's only the Pacifica Hybrid. There's no Voyager Hybrid. For this model year, the Pacifica brings us a new front grille design, new full LED headlights, LED fog lights down below. The Voyager isn't exactly the pre-refresh Pacifica, but it does look an awful lot more like that model. So if you prefer the older look to the Pacifica, there's a Chrysler Voyager for you. If you like the new look, there's a Pacifica. Regardless of what Chrysler's marketing department might say, Chrysler did not create the world's first small van. But what they did do is come to define what minivan means to an American. Back in the 80s, when Chrysler released their first minivans, the formula for their creation was arguably very similar to what we see in minivans of today. They used a passenger car platform, which meant it had more car-like driving dynamics than the truck-based vans that we'd seen before, but it still held 7 or 8 people. And because of the boxy proportions, the third row in those early minivans was just about as comfortable, just about as usable as the second row in modern minivans is today. Now, modern minivans have sacrificed a little bit of third row comfort for increased pragmatism and increased practicality versus those older minivans that were very, very boxy, and the third and second rows were often interchangeable. You could literally just unscrew this one and pop it in the second row if you wanted to. As you'd expect out of a modern Familymobile, all of Chrysler's latest active driver assistance technologies are available on the Pacifica. Some are standard, some are optional. Not quite as many are standard on this as we find in some of the alternatives out there. Definitely keep that in mind. But by the time you've worked your way up to the trim that I'm driving, they're all on this model. And you will find more of those driver assistance technologies available on this than are available on the competition. Under the hood, we find a variant of the same 3.6-liter V6 engine that we find in the regular Pacifica. Only this engine has been tweaked to run on the Atkinson cycle, which trades horsepower for efficiency. It's the same operating cycle that we find most Toyota hybrids running. Combined with the electric motors that are on this side of the engine bay, you get 260 horsepower and performance that is surprisingly similar to the regular Pacifica, even though we get less power, and that's all thanks to the motors. Motors have an awful lot of torque, and we have a big battery pack between the seats that really helps this vehicle get 0 to 60 pretty quickly, despite weighing about 5,000 pounds. When operating in electric-only mode, the power output from the two electric motors working together is about 100 to 110 horsepower. Chrysler is not terribly specific on the output in EV mode, but that seems to be about where it's going to be. Combined fuel economy when operating as a hybrid is 30 mpg, and you'll get 32 miles of EV range if the battery is completely full. In EV mode, this vehicle is capable of operating at speeds over 80 miles an hour as long as you're pretty gentle on the throttle. And if you're in a temperate climate, it won't ever need to start the gasoline engine to heat the cabin because it does have a resistive element heater. However, if you live in an area that's colder, it may start the gasoline engine, at least initially, to help heat up the cabin, after which it'll turn it off and then run entirely on the electric motors and the battery again. Why might you want to get a plug-in hybrid minivan? Well, there are a few reasons. Obviously, if you want to reduce your carbon emissions, you can shift some of your consumption from gasoline over to electricity. And when operating as a hybrid, it's going to be getting considerably better fuel economy than the non-hybrid Pacifica. Another reason is because you want to avoid the 9-speed automatic transmission in the Pacifica. It's not my favorite transmission. This completely avoids it. It uses a completely different transmission. Not stopping as frequently for gasoline is definitely going to be a big consideration on my daily commute of 28 miles each way. If I plug this in on either side of my commute, I do use a little bit of gasoline going up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass, but it would reduce my gasoline consumption to about 1 gallon a week. So I would get about 4,200 miles out of one tank of gas. So if you hate going by the gas station, that's another reason that you might want to get this over something like a regular hybrid. And lastly, if you live in a cold climate and you want your vehicle to preheat itself inside your garage, this is going to be an excellent option because you don't have to open your garage door. You can leave your garage door closed. As long as this is plugged in using the electric cable, it will heat the cabin using household electricity. Then you can hop in and then drive along for 30 miles on EV only. A number of people I know that live in the snow belt have told me that that was a major reason for choosing this over some of the competition, that you wouldn't be able to just remote start without leaving your garage door open. So what's the catch? Well, I count two. There's no spare tire and there's no second row stow and go because there's nowhere for those features to go. The 16 kilowatt hour lithium ion battery pack is positioned between the first row seats and the second row seats, sort of in this area of the cabin right there. That's where the second row stow and go seats would fold down into. On the other hand, the second row seats are removable from the vehicle, which is a little bit different than we find in the new Sienna. Those seats are permanently fixed into place. These seats are lighter than the ones that we find in the Honda Odyssey, about 8 pounds lighter, because the seat belt is part of the minivan, not part of the seat like we see in the Honda. But aside from that, the rest of the Pacifica's interior is largely the same. One key difference between this and the competition is that the passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat, the seat bottom cushion adjusts for tilt, and we have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support. Two features that are missing in most of the competition. Combined legroom, that would be front row plus second row plus third row, is a little bit behind the Odyssey and Sienna, but honestly most people won't notice. The second row seats slide forward and backwards, so you could give the third row a little bit more room if you needed to. And of course the second row seats recline, but these seats don't move sideways or extra far back like we find in the Japanese competition. On the other hand, we do have a rear seat entertainment system that does more than simply play DVDs. So if you're interested in rear seat entertainment and you want to be able to have the kids play games, you can play games with one another, etc. And we have two different HDMI inputs, so they can be watching different things if they want to. The Odyssey and Sienna both have a single LCD infotainment system right here in the vehicle. That means that the third row might be able to watch it a little bit more easily than these two systems. However, it's only one system. The position of the entertainment system in those two minivans also means that we don't get this feature right here, which is a large panoramic moonroof that spans the second row and the first row. Then there's a second moonroof right back there for the third row. If you're the kind of person that does want to heft these second row seats in and out of the vehicle on a regular basis, this feature is going to make you happy. This vehicle retains the button required for the stow and go system to operate properly. I press the button, front row seat moves forward right like that. That means that it's going to be easier to get this seat out of position. I simply pull this webbing and then tilt it all the way forward and off of its mounts. In the competition with removable seats, we have the same problem if you have the seat all the way forward as we find in the Pacifica, but we don't have a method to make that front seat motion as quick and as easy. And if I just go back in here and then relatch this seat, if I can get it back in its tracks, this requires a special art right there, then you can see that I can just press that button and the front seat will return to its original position. Getting into the third row is pretty easy, although a little bit less easy if you have a child seat in the second row versus the model with the second row stow and go. That's because these seats do not move in a way where you can keep a child seat latch anchored into position and still tilt and slide that forward. However, there's definitely enough room to get comfortably through there. And if I pull this seat all the way back in its tracks and then tilt it back into position, you can see I have a generous amount of legroom left, about 3 inches. But more important versus the competition is the headroom. If I put my head all the way back against the headrest, I have about 3/4 of an inch to an inch of headroom left. And that is certainly more than we find in the Sienna and the Odyssey. In the Sienna and the Odyssey, if I put my head back against the headrest, my head is touching the ceiling because the rear ceiling area right back there around the hatch is not as square and it's not as high off the ground as we find in the Pacifica. Now, if I were sitting more naturally like this where my head is not touching the headrest, then in those vehicles I do have about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of headroom. But if you wanted to be more comfortable back here and rest your head on the headrest for a longer journey, this is going to be an awful lot more comfortable for taller folks in the third row. All three of these major players have a 3-person bench in the back. Just in case you're wondering, I'm not ignoring the Kia Carnival. I haven't driven it yet, so I'm reserving an opinion until I can actually drive it. But you should know that the third row bench in the Sienna and in the Pacifica is a little bit wider than the one that we find in the Odyssey. I was able to get all 3 of those minivans at the same time this week. Be sure and check out that video. I will have that posted up a little bit after this video. And the cargo area width right here, or the third row width between the rear wheel wells, is about 1 inch wider in the Pacifica and the Sienna versus the Odyssey. That means that third row passengers are going to get a little bit more room, and cargo is also going to get a bit more room. Back in the Cretaceous era, when I was a young kid and my parents bought their very first minivan, the load floor was incredibly flat. In fact, it was flat. It was just a single flat thing all the way to the very front of the vehicle. But modern minivans are a little bit different because they've been able to incorporate some practical features since then, like third row seats that fold back into the trunk. Every modern American minivan has this particular feature, whether we're talking about the Pacifica, the Odyssey, the Carnival, etc. Now, it is a little bit easier to do in this or in the Odyssey. It's a one-handed operation right like that, a simple flip and fold. In the Sienna, the third row mechanism just isn't quite as easy to use one-handed. I thought maybe I was crazy, so I had a few other people try it this week, and everybody thought that the Odyssey and the Pacifica's third row action was a little bit easier. On the left side of the cargo area, there's a little bit of additional storage space. It goes quite far back there, so you can put the EVSE right there in its little bag. That's also where we find the tire inflator kit. As with the Sienna and the Odyssey, this clearly gets 10 out of 10 points when it comes to my exclusive trunk comfort index. One feature that shorter people or people with kids might like is that the button to close the rear hatch is right over here rather than on the hatch lid itself. It's about 2 feet lower. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are not in the top end trim. That would be the Pinnacle, so there are going to be features in there that we don't see in here. We have the controls for the openable section of the moonroof right over here, controls for the electric shade right over there, and then the controls for the side doors and the rear hatch. I like the fact that they're positioned here rather than to the left of the driver like we find in some of the competition. That means the passenger can also open those doors when needed. The front section of the moonroof is the one that opens. It's the one right here above the driver and front passengers' heads. You can see that it extends to just over that second row. The driver and front passenger get height adjustable shoulder belts, 4-way adjustable headrests, and you can see that we have these very eccentric red seats. Some people on our Facebook page have said that they really don't like this look, but I have to say, I really love different colors, because if it wasn't for the red seats and these were black, this interior would really just be a sea of black. And I do like the fact that some manufacturers are willing to give us some additional colors. Let's hope that Toyota does that with the Sienna, because they're starting to bring red interiors across a number of their vehicles in the United States. Moving over to the dashboard, you'll notice that the majority of this dash remains the same as the pre-refresh model. All these controls right here in the center console are essentially the same. We have the rotary style shifter, etc., but the big change happens in the middle. This is one of the first vehicles to get the new Uconnect 5 infotainment system. We're also going to be seeing this in the refreshed Durango, the new Jeep Grand Wagoneer, Jeep Grand Cherokees, etc. when they come out. The first thing you'll notice is that this screen is much higher resolution than the one that it replaces. CarPlay can handle screens of a variety of different resolutions. You'll really notice that if I zoom in on sort of a suburban area here, you can see all those little street details. It's definitely much nicer and much crisper than before. The system operates a little bit differently. We always have some controls available up top, things like the heated and ventilated seats right over here for the driver and front passenger, heated steering wheel, a button to access the rear seat camera system, so you can see the third row and the second row. This camera system is placed a little bit differently than some of the competition, so it's right here, sort of between the two rows of seats. The rest of the system graphics have definitely been updated versus the previous version. There's a configurable home screen right there. We have some media screens if you'd rather use that rather than CarPlay to interact with your media devices. There's also a factory nav interface. The comfort screen is basically climate control. And a feature that we don't find in the Sienna for some reason, we have the ability to lock out the rear controls if you don't want the kids playing with that. Under vehicle, we have the controls for the plug-in hybrid system. You can see that right now the engine is on, charging the battery because we've been idling here just a little bit too long. You can also schedule your charging right here. And then there's apps. This is where we find all the various system options here, all in app format, Amazon Alexa, weather, the surround camera system, etc. You can assign these shortcuts to various positions in the system to make it a little bit more customizable. And the system supports multiple home pages, so I can just swipe across, get a different one, and I can activate or deactivate the heated seats, ventilated seats, etc. In this model, the bulk of the dashboard is a soft-touch injection molded plastic that has then been after-stitched to give this the impression of a stitched dashboard. We have a rotary-style shifter here, electric parking brake, physical controls for the infotainment and climate control system, so you don't have to use the touchscreen if you'd rather just play with those physical buttons. And then we have the button for the autonomous parking system, a feature that for some reason we don't find in all the competition. Below that, we find a single-disc Blu-ray player, a USB input for the rear seat entertainment systems, a storage area that slides open and has 4 USB ports in there, USB-C and regular USB. There's also a Qi wireless charging mat. The system does support wireless Apple CarPlay, and a nice area right there where you can store keys and other items, that way they don't accidentally hop there on that charging mat. There aren't as many cup holders within reach of the driver as in the new Sienna, but these cup holders are larger. I was able to fit a 32-ounce hydro flask in there. I could not in the Odyssey or in the Sienna. We have a moderately sized storage area here with a USB charge port, 12-volt charge port, and then a roller style cover. If you're wondering why there isn't too much room, that's because there is another storage cubby that's accessed here. I can pull that out, get 2 cup holders right there. These cup holders are removable, or if I can do this kind of a acrobatic act there, I can pull it all the way out and get a deeper storage area, and this does stay in this position. It won't retract back in. So if you wanted to put a bag or a purse or something like that there, you could, and you can remove those cup holders. As we see in other minivans, there's also a storage area under the center console, but it is smaller than the ones that we see in the Sienna and the Odyssey. The instrument cluster is a partial LCD unit. We have a power and charge gauge on the left side and a large fuel gauge over here on the right. Completing the circle on the other side of the fuel gauge is the range indicator for the entire vehicle. So 299 miles of total range, 297 miles of gasoline, 2 miles of battery. There's no separate battery gauge, but we do have a battery percentage level right there on top. This display gives us the same basic readouts that you see in every Chrysler vehicle out there. So system messages, screen setup options, so you could adjust the look of the display a little bit. The theme doesn't really change too much. We do have a large digital speedometer, vehicle info like coolant temperature, oil temperature, things like that. As you'd expect, fuel economy screens and hybrid information screens so you can see exactly what the system is up to. The steering wheel uses the same basic design that we see in a wide variety of Chrysler, Dodge, and Ram vehicles. It has the infotainment buttons on the back of the steering wheel, so track up, down on the left, volume up, down on the right. It's definitely very thickly rimmed, much more thickly rimmed than the rest of the minivan competition, so if you prefer a thicker steering wheel, this is definitely going to be a good option. For winter operation, the steering wheel is heated in this trim, and that definitely heats up the strip quickly, but in the summer, this is going to be a little bit hot in Georgia. On the left side of the wheel, we find the controls for that multifunction LCD instrument cluster, and then on the right side, we find the controls for the regular cruise control and then adaptive cruise control below. This isn't technically Chrysler's first hybrid. They did have a hybrid Chrysler Aspen, but this is Chrysler's first plug-in hybrid, and I'm really surprised by that in a way because this has a level of polish that you generally don't expect from first attempts. A lot of other car companies out there, especially some of the German and European car companies, their first plug-in hybrid attempts have been a little rough around the edges, and then over time they've refined the concept. The concept of this system's operation is quite similar to what we see in the Chevy Volt and the Prius Prime, actually. The two electric motors can work together to drive the vehicle forward. That improves efficiency, and it also helps reduce the size of the electric motors individually. It helps them package it a little bit better into the case and then operate a little bit more effectively as a hybrid when the gasoline engine is required. One of the oddities with this system versus a lot of the plug-in hybrids out there is that there are no knobs or buttons to control the drive mode. If there's battery charge, it will default to electric operation. If there's no battery charge, it will default to hybrid operation. There's no way to say, I'd like to save my battery for later, and there's no way to say, please use all the battery right now. In electric-only mode, the system is capable of delivering about 110 horsepower or so. That may not sound like a great deal, but this has a reasonable acceleration to it even in EV drive mode. That's because there's an awful lot of torque from those electric motors. And if you needed more oomph, there's the gasoline engine for that, up to 260 horsepower total. Transitions between gasoline drive mode and electric drive mode are pretty seamless. I would actually say a little bit more seamless than in the last Chevy Volt that I drove. We also have pretty aggressive regen braking here. If I put it in the L mode, it's going to command about 50 kilowatts of regen. That is pretty hardy. The max regen that you can get in a Tesla Model 3 is about 75 kilowatts or so, 75, 80. And if I apply the brake, this does have blended braking, this will actually go just a little bit above what we see in some Tesla models out there, putting about 80 kilowatts back in the battery. So the brakes in this vehicle are actually quite infrequently used. Logically, long-term maintenance costs are one of the reasons that you might want to consider a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid like this, so more than likely these brakes will last just as long or longer than we see in a lot of Toyota hybrids. It's one thing that a lot of Toyota hybrid owners have commented on as being one of the big selling points for them in a hybrid vehicle. As far as acceleration figures go, this went 0 to 60 in 7.2 seconds. That's just a hair slower than the last Pacifica hybrid that I tested, probably well within the margin of error for this vehicle. In my 60 to 0 braking test, this model stopped in 136 feet. That's really close to the Sienna hybrid, which surprised me, because the model that I'm driving today weighs about 5,000 pounds, actually just a little bit over. And that is all because of the big battery. Logically, with this much weight on board, handling is not going to be as good as the non-hybrid Pacifica or the non-hybrid competition, but honestly, Chrysler has done a really good job of masking the extra weight. It's also well distributed in the vehicle since it's happening back there behind me. Obviously, the laws of physics have to be obeyed, so the tires are going to start to squeal a little bit before the competition, but Chrysler has done a good job with the steering feel in the Pacifica as well. I actually like the steering feel in here a little bit better than we find in the Odyssey. As far as ride quality goes, I rank this the best in the minivan segment. A lot of that is likely the extra weight of the battery pack, because I think the hybrid model rides a little bit better than the non-hybrid model. I'm certainly going to give this an A when it comes to the ride score. I'm also going to give this an A when it comes to cabin noise. I measured 70 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour, making this quieter than the Odyssey and just a hair quieter than the Sienna. One of the weird things about this hybrid system is the way that Chrysler computes their fuel economy. In the Chevy Volt, it basically disregarded the energy as completely free. So if I drove 100 miles and I just used 1 gallon of gasoline, it would say I got 100 mpg. It was as if the electricity didn't count. Chrysler, on the other hand, goes in an opposite direction, and that makes the fuel economy calculations seem oddly low in the instrument cluster, actually. So if I, for instance, put 1 gallon in this vehicle and I drove 100 miles on that 1 gallon of gasoline, its fuel economy computer is going to show me about 32 to 33 mpg. That's because when operating on electricity, this vehicle is trying to assign some sort of value to the electricity consumed and then give you a calculated value smushed in there with the gasoline consumption and then displayed in the instrument cluster. On my daily commute, I averaged better fuel economy in this than in the Toyota Sienna, but that requires an explanation. It's because going down the hill in the Sienna Hybrid, the battery fills up completely about a quarter of the way down the hill. This vehicle does not. It's able to keep regenerating power into the battery and then spend that energy driving an electric-only operation for about 4 miles or so after the vehicle hits level ground. Because the Sienna's battery is much smaller than this, that is not an option. So on my daily commute, this vehicle got nearly 35 mpg, pretty close to what the Sienna is theoretically EPA rated for, whereas the Sienna ended up right around 27 or 28 mpg depending on the day that I was driving it. That really surprised me because this is heavier than the Sienna Hybrid. Now, if I drove this on my usual fuel economy test loop, the same one that I drive every new vehicle here at Alex and Autos on, then this one got an awful lot closer to the EPA number, 31 mpg in that test. And the Sienna was an awful lot closer to its EPA number. It actually ended up beating it by 1 mpg. It's up there at 36 mpg. The other things that are really impressive with the system are that transitions between EV mode and hybrid mode are almost seamless, and transitions between regen braking and friction braking are a little bit better done than we find in most of Toyota's hybrids. Some of Toyota's hybrids have kind of an odd delay. If you're applying moderate braking and then you switch to aggressive braking, there's kind of a weird disconnect there. We don't find that in this. Now, that's not to say that the brakes in the Pacifica Hybrid feel just like the non-hybrid, but these are an awful lot closer to the average gasoline car than what we find in the Sienna. This also feels an awful lot more like an electric minivan, just as we find in the Toyota hybrids, because of the design of this hybrid system. So if that's the kind of feel you want out on the road, that's what you'll find in here and in the new Sienna Hybrid. It's hard to talk about the hybrid without talking about the non-hybrid models. Let's go through all the pricing now, and I will have a video separately on the Pacifica all-wheel drive at some point later in the year. The non-hybrid Pacifica starts at $35,195. That is one of the higher starting prices in the minivan segment right now, but that's primarily because we also have the Chrysler Voyager. If you want the hybrid model, that's $39,995, so a decent bump over the non-hybrid model, but you may get a federal tax credit. Now, big disclaimer on this one is that you do have to have a minimum $7,500 federal tax liability in order to qualify for the full $7,500 tax credit. So not everybody may qualify for that. It also is not able to be rolled forward. So if you don't have $7,500 minimum of federal tax liability this year and you buy one, you cannot push part of that credit off to the next year. However, if you do qualify for the full credit, it ends up being one of the least expensive minivans in America. I think one of the surprising things about the Pacifica lineup is that leather happens so early in the lineup. $42,295 for the L trim, just one step above the bottom model, gets you leather, heated seats, a heated steering wheel, and a power driver's seat with memory. We do get memory seats now in the Pacifica Hybrid. That was something that wasn't offered when the hybrid first launched a number of years ago. Now let's dive into the competition. The first competitor has to be the Honda Odyssey, because depending on the year you're looking at, this is either the best-selling minivan or the second best-selling minivan. Now, for 2020 and 2021, Chrysler regained the sales crown, and 2021, I suspect that with the new cheaper Voyager model in the lineup and all-wheel drive, it's going to continue beating all the other minivans in terms of sales. Let's run through the pros and cons. 0 to 60 time is excellent in the Odyssey thanks to the 10-speed automatic transmission, but you can't get all-wheel drive, something that you will find in the non-hybrid Pacifica. Operating costs are obviously going to be higher than the Pacifica Hybrid. It is a significant difference if you're driving 15,000 miles a year, especially if you're able to plug your Pacifica Hybrid in. I don't find the seats in the Odyssey quite as practical as the ones in the Pacifica. They're notably heavier if you want to remove the second row seats, and if you get the upper end trims with the magic sliding second row seat, then you have that big hump in the floor that doesn't come out of the vehicle. The third row seats look like they'd be just about as comfortable as a Pacifica, but if you're trying to put adults back there, keep in mind that headroom is going to be more generous in the Chrysler. A common reason cited for buying the Odyssey over the Chrysler is reliability, but when you take a look at the latest Consumer Reports reliability numbers, these two vehicles are honestly pretty even. They both score the same 3 out of 5 points. Oddly enough, no minivan in this segment scores 5 out of 5 points. The Sienna is only 1 point higher at 4 out of 5 points, and the Carnival is somewhere in this same range as well. One of the really great things about the Odyssey is that you can get 8 seats in every version of the Odyssey, including the top-end Elite trim. Now keep in mind that you don't find the same sort of features in the top-end Elite model that you will find in the Pacifica or in some of the competition, but you still can get that top-end model with the middle seat in the second row. And for some reason, that is not something that you can do in any other minivan in America right now. Moving along, the other all-wheel drive minivan in this segment is the Toyota Sienna. It starts at $34,460. That is a reasonable bump over the previous generation model because all Siennas are now hybrids and all get really incredible fuel economy on the EPA ratings. 36 mpg. Now, I have noticed that some folks out there have been unable to get 36 mpg out of their Sienna. It does require that you're driving it somewhat gently, and if you really load it up and you start driving on mountain passes, hill climbing, etc., you'll notice that the fuel economy will drop. Depending on exactly where you're going and the driving cycle that you're doing, the Pacifica Hybrid may or may not get better fuel economy than the Sienna. This is really one of those your mileage will vary situations. Remember that the Pacifica is an awful lot heavier, but it has a much bigger battery pack. So on my daily commute where I go up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass, the Pacifica ended up being more efficient than the Sienna, primarily because it could recapture all that energy going up and down the hill. But in level steady-state travel, the Sienna is going to be the more efficient option. As far as cost of operation goes, the difference between these two vehicles will really depend on how often you can plug your vehicle in. If you plug your Pacifica in all the time, it's going to be considerably less expensive to operate than the Sienna. If you're plugging it in rarely or just sort of here and there, then the costs may be somewhat equal. And if you never plug it in and you live in a fairly flat area, the Pacifica is going to be a little bit more expensive to operate. One difference that won't change, however, is that the Sienna is going to be always the slowest option in this minivan segment. It has a lot less power, a lot less torque, a 4-cylinder engine. There's no way around it. It is quite simply the slowest minivan in America right now. The other thing to keep in mind is that the second row seats do not come out of the Sienna at all. I know some folks have sent me videos of people unbolting their Sienna second row seats. I would really recommend that you don't do that. There are airbags in there. You have to disconnect the battery. You have to mess with airbag systems. You can cause airbag errors in the vehicle. The airbags are integrated into the second row seats. They're not designed to be removed by you as the consumer, only by the dealer if they need service. So definitely keep that in mind. Next up, we have the newest minivan in America, sort of the un-minivan, the Kia Carnival. They used to call this one the Sedona, but Kia decided to harmonize the naming scheme across all world markets. It's been called the Carnival in Korea for a while, so now everybody gets the same name. Silly name aside, I'm not the biggest fan of the Carnival name, but the rest of the minivan, honestly, is really, really well done. Kia went out of their way to give us the biggest cargo area in this segment. It's about 30% bigger than the cargo area that we find in the Pacifica, the Sienna, and the Odyssey, which are all very, very close together. I initially thought that that was a mistake, to be honest. I thought it was a typo, that Kia was being crazy, but I was able to fit 8 24-inch roller bags in the back of the Carnival. The second row seats finally come out of the vehicle. The last generation model didn't do that. They went back to that for this generation. The center console is definitely very SUV-like in the Carnival, and as a result, there just aren't as many storage cubbies or slots or cup holders or places to stick your things as we find in especially the Sienna, which I think has one of the more practical cargo areas up front. Bottom line, in the minivan segment, it's easy to see why the Chrysler minivans sell so well. They have a long history of minivan innovation, and that really shows with especially the second row seats in the regular minivan, the plug-in hybrid system, just the level of features and functions that we find in the Pacifica. A lot of them are really, really well done, and I think well done for the target market of the family. Because if you get the regular Pacifica, it's the only one where you can keep a child seat latched into the second row and still tilt that seat forward to get easily into the third row. For some reason, that's a feature missing on all the rest of the competition. That means that if you are using that center seat in the 8-passenger version of the Carnival or the Sienna or the Odyssey, getting into the third row is going to be a lot trickier than in the regular Pacifica. Now, that advantage disappears when we take a look at the Pacifica plug-in hybrid, which is, I think, my favorite Pacifica, but you get the benefit of the plug-in hybrid system. Honestly, if I were looking for a minivan right now, my top 2 picks would be the new Carnival and the Pacifica Hybrid, but I think the Pacifica Hybrid gets the nudge because of its practicality and especially its fuel economy. It is very, very impressive. And I'm really surprised that Chrysler doesn't stick this plug-in hybrid system in anything else in the United States. You will find it in China in a number of Jeeps, but in the US at the moment, it really sits alone just in the Pacifica. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Be sure and check out the merch store where you can find some minivan t-shirts or some third row t-shirts, right like the one that I'm wearing here. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you next week.